reached his breaking point on live television. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below because this story has more twists than you might expect. The atmosphere in the View studio that morning felt different from the usual buzz of celebrity interviews. Will Smith had arrived to promote his latest project, expecting the typical mix of light banter and promotional questions that had become routine for him over decades in the spotlight. He settled into the familiar hot seat, adjusting his jacket and flashing that trademark smile that had charmed audiences worldwide. The other hosts, Whoopi Goldberg, Sarah Haynes, and the rest of the panel, seemed relaxed and ready for what should have been a straightforward 20-minute segment. But Joy Behar had other plans. From the moment the cameras started rolling, there was an edge to her voice that caught everyone off guard. While the other hosts welcomed Smith warmly, Joy's greeting carried an undertone that suggested she was looking for something more than just pleasantries. "Will, thanks for being here," Joy began, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Though I have to say, some of us were wondering if you'd actually show up today." The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Will's expression shifted slightly, the practiced media smile wavering for just a moment before he recovered. "Well, Joy, I'm here, aren't I?" he replied, keeping his tone light but measured. "Ready to talk about the new film and connect with the audience." "Oh, we'll get to the film," Joy said, leaning back in her chair with the confidence of someone who held all the cards. "But first, I think our viewers deserve some honesty about the elephant in the room. You've been pretty quiet lately about certain, shall we say, controversial topics. Some might call that convenient." Whoopi shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly sensing where this was heading. "Joy, maybe we should start with the project Will's here to discuss," she suggested diplomatically. But Joy wasn't deterred. "I think our audience is smart enough to handle a real conversation, don't you, Will? They can see through the usual promotional dance." Will straightened in his chair, his media training kicking in as he tried to navigate what was clearly becoming a minefield. "I'm always happy to have real conversations, Joy. That's what makes shows like this special. But I'm curious what you mean by controversial topics." "Oh, come on," Joy said with a laugh that carried no warmth. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. Your silence on certain political issues, your carefully crafted public image. Some people are saying you're more concerned with protecting your brand than speaking truth." The accusation was delivered with the kind of calculated precision that made it clear this wasn't spontaneous. This was planned, orchestrated, designed to provoke a reaction. Will's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained controlled. "Joy, I've always believed that my platform comes with responsibility. When I speak on issues, I try to make sure I'm informed and that my voice adds value to the conversation rather than just adding noise." "That's a very diplomatic way of saying you stay quiet when it might cost you money?" Joy shot back, her tone growing sharper. "Some of us remember when celebrities actually stood for something, when they were willing to risk their careers for their principles." The studio fell silent except for the hum of cameras and equipment. Even the production crew seemed to sense that this had moved beyond typical daytime television territory into something much more volatile. Will took a deep breath, his hands clasped in his lap. "I respect your perspective, Joy. But I think you're making some assumptions about my motivations that aren't accurate. My approach to activism and public discourse might be different from yours, but that doesn't make it less valid." "Different," Joy repeated, as if tasting the word. "That's one way to put it. Another way might be cowardly." The word hit the studio like a lightning bolt. Sarah Haynes audibly gasped, while Whoopi's eyes widened in alarm. This had crossed a line that even The View's famously heated discussions rarely approached. Will's composure finally began to crack, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Joy continued, seemingly energized by getting a reaction. "Cowardly. You built your career on being likable, on being safe, on never rocking the boat. And now, when the world is burning and people are looking for leadership, where's Will Smith, hiding behind his publicist and his carefully managed image?" "Joy," Whoopi interjected firmly, "I think we need to pump the brakes here." But Joy was on a roll now, her voice rising with each word. "No, Whoopi, I think we need to have this conversation. Our viewers deserve to know who they're really supporting when they buy tickets to see his movies. They deserve to know if their heroes actually have any principles or if it's all just another performance. Will stood up slowly, his full height imposing even in the seated panel format. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but carried the weight of years of frustration. You want to know about principles, Joy? Let me tell you about principles. Principles mean treating people with respect, even when you disagree with them. Principles mean not ambushing someone who came here in good faith to have a conversation. Principles mean recognizing that there's more than one way to make a difference in this world. Joy leaned forward, sensing she had him on the defensive. Pretty words, Will, but what have you actually done? What risks have you actually taken? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like a whole lot of nothing wrapped up in a pretty speech. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Will Smith's eyes flashed with something the other hosts had never seen before. A glimpse of the man behind the carefully constructed public persona. His voice, when he spoke, carried a dangerous quiet that made everyone in the studio lean forward. You want to know what I've done, Joy? You really want to go there? His tone was measured, but there was steel underneath. Let's talk about the Will Smith Foundation. Let's talk about the schools I've helped build, the scholarships I've funded, the communities I've invested in. But I suppose that doesn't count because I didn't hold a press conference for every check I wrote. Joy waved her hand dismissively, as if swatting away his words. Oh, please, charity write-offs and photo opportunities. I'm talking about real courage, real leadership. I'm talking about using your voice when it matters, not just when it's safe. Safe? Will's voice rose for the first time, his composure finally beginning to fray. You think anything about my career has been safe? You think being a black man in Hollywood, fighting for roles that weren't stereotypes, pushing for stories that actually mattered, was safe? You think starting a production company to create opportunities for people who look like me was safe? Sarah Haynes tried to interject, sensing the conversation spiraling beyond anyone's control. Maybe we should take a breath here and... No. Joy cut her off sharply, her eyes never leaving Will's face. This is exactly the conversation we need to have. Because, Mr. Smith here wants credit for doing the bare minimum, while staying silent on the issues that actually define our times. Tell me, Will, where were you during the healthcare debates? Where was your voice during the voting rights discussions? Nowhere to be found because taking a stand might hurt your box office numbers. Will's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his breathing becoming more controlled in the way of someone fighting to maintain composure. You don't know what you're talking about, Joy. You don't know the conversations I've had behind closed doors, the meetings I've attended, the work I've done that doesn't make headlines because it's not about publicity. It's about results. Behind closed doors, Joy laughed, and the sound was sharp and mocking. How convenient. The invisible activism that nobody can verify. How very noble of you to do all this secret good work while your public platform remains pristine and profitable. Whoopi finally found her voice, her tone carrying the authority of the show's moderator. Joy, I think we're getting off track here. Will came on to talk about his new project, and our audience has a right to know who they're supporting. Joy interrupted again, her voice growing more strident. They have a right to know if their heroes are actually heroes, or just very good actors playing heroes on screen. And right now, all I'm seeing is a very good actor who's forgotten the difference. That was the moment something shifted in Will's demeanor. The careful media training, the years of diplomatic responses, the practiced smile. All of it fell away, like a mask being removed. When he spoke, his voice was raw with genuine emotion. You want to see the real me, Joy? You want to strip away the actor and see what's underneath? Fine. Let's do that. But you better be ready for what you find, because the real me doesn't have patience for people who mistake cruelty for courage and bullying for journalism. The words hit Joy like a physical blow, but instead of backing down, she seemed to feed off the confrontation. There it is. There's the real Will Smith. Threatening a journalist for doing her job, for asking the hard questions that your publicist probably told you would never come up. Threatening? Will's voice was incredulous. Lady, if you think that was a threat, you've been living in your bubble so long you've forgotten what real conflict looks like. I'm not threatening you. I'm trying to explain to you the difference between asking hard questions and launching personal attacks. Joy leaned back in her chair with satisfaction, like a chess player who had just cornered her opponent's king. Personal attacks? Everything I've said has been about your public record, your public choices, your public silence. If you're taking it personally, maybe that says more about your conscience than my questions. My conscience? Will stepped closer to the panel, his presence suddenly dominating the space. You want to talk about conscience? Let's talk about yours, Joy. Let's talk about how you turned what was supposed to be a conversation about art and storytelling into a character assassination. Let's talk about how you ambushed someone who came here in good faith because you thought it would make good television. For the first time since the confrontation began, Joy's confident facade flickered slightly, but she recovered quickly, her voice taking on a defensive edge disguised as righteousness. I didn't ambush anyone. I asked legitimate questions that any journalist worth her salt would ask. If you can't handle tough questions, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews. Maybe you should stick to your scripted movies where everyone says exactly what you want to hear. Tough questions? Will laughed, but there was no humor in it. Joy, tough questions are about policy, about choices, about vision. What you're doing is trying to create drama for ratings. What you're doing is trying to tear down someone you don't even know because it makes you feel important. The studio was dead silent except for the mechanical sounds of cameras continuing to roll. The other hosts sat frozen, unsure whether to intervene or let this explosive moment play out. Production assistants hovered nervously at the edges of the set, clearly getting instructions through their headsets about whether to keep rolling or cut to commercial. Joy's voice, when she spoke again, carried a tremor of anger that she tried to mask with professional detachment. I've been doing this job for decades, Will. I've interviewed presidents and prime ministers, Nobel Prize winners and world leaders. I don't need lectures about journalism from someone whose biggest credential is pretending to be other people for a living. Will's response came swift and cutting. And in all those decades, Joy, did you learn anything about the difference between holding people accountable and tearing them down for sport? Because right now, I'm not seeing a journalist. I'm seeing someone who's forgotten that there are human beings on the other side of your questions. The words landed with the force of a slap. Joy's face flushed red, her carefully applied makeup suddenly seeming like war paint in the harsh studio lights. Her voice, when it came, was tight with barely controlled fury. Don't you dare lecture me about humanity, Joy snapped, her voice cracking with indignation. I've spent my entire career fighting for the underdog, speaking truth to power, holding celebrities like you accountable when you think you're above criticism. If you can't handle that, then maybe you're not the man you pretend to be. Will's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper that somehow carried more weight than any shout. Fighting for the underdog? Joy, right now you are the power. You're sitting behind that desk with cameras rolling, using your platform to attack someone who came here as your guest. If you can't see the irony in that, then you're even more lost than I thought. The accusation hit its mark. Joy's face contorted with rage, all pretense of professional composure finally abandoning her. Lost? I'm lost? You're the one who's lost, Will. Lost in your own mythology, lost in your bubble of yes-men and sycophants who tell you everything you want to hear. Well, here's something you don't want to hear. You're not as important as you think you are. And neither are you, Will shot back without hesitation. The difference is, I'm not trying to tear down other people to prove my relevance. I'm not using my platform to bully guests who trusted me enough to sit in that chair. Joy stood up abruptly, her chair rolling backward with the force. Bully? Bully? You want to see bullying, Will? Bullying is using your fame and fortune to silence critics. Bullying is expecting everyone to treat you like royalty just because you've made some movies. Bullying is what you're doing right now, trying to intimidate me because I dared to ask you real questions. The irony of her words, delivered while she loomed over the seated panel in a clear display of dominance, was lost on no one except Joy herself. Will stood to match her height, his presence suddenly filling the space between them. Real questions? Joy, you haven't asked me one real question since this started. You've made accusations, you've hurled insults, you've tried to provoke reactions. But you haven't asked me about my work, my perspective, or anything that might actually inform your audience. You've turned this into a circus with yourself as the ringmaster. Whoopi finally found the courage to stand as well, her voice carrying the authority of someone trying to regain control of her own show. Okay, both of you need to step back. This is getting out of hand. We're going to take a commercial break and reset this conversation. But Joy wasn't finished. Her voice rose to nearly a shout, her finger pointing accusingly at Will. No. Whoopee. I'm not done. Mr. Smith wants to paint me as the villain here. But I'm the one asking the questions that need to be asked. I'm the one holding him accountable for his choices, his silence, his complicity in maintaining a status quo that benefits him while others suffer. Will's composure finally snapped completely, his voice rising to match hers. My complicity? Joy. The only thing I'm complicit in is giving you more respect than you deserve. I came here thinking I was going to have a conversation with professionals, not walk into an ambush orchestrated by someone who thinks cruelty equals courage. There it is again, Joy practically shrieked, her voice echoing through the studio. Playing the victim. The poor misunderstood movie star who just wants to be treated nicely. Well, here's a newsflash, Will. The world doesn't owe you nice treatment. The world doesn't owe you softball questions and gentle handling. And the world doesn't owe you ratings either, Will fired back, his voice cutting through her hysteria like a blade. But that's what this is really about, isn't it, Joy? This isn't about journalism or accountability or any of the noble causes you're hiding behind. This is about you trying to create a moment that will get people talking, even if it means destroying someone's reputation in the process. Joy's face went white with fury, her hands shaking as she pointed at him. How dare you question my motives? How dare you suggest that I would compromise my integrity for ratings? I have been fighting battles since before you were famous, and I'll be fighting them long after you're forgotten. If this is your idea of fighting, Joy, then you're fighting the wrong battles, Will replied, his voice now cold and controlled again. Real fighters don't punch down. Real fighters don't ambush their allies. Real fighters save their energy for the people who are actually causing harm in the world. The studio erupted as Joy lost all semblance of control, her voice becoming shrill and desperate. Allies? You think you're my ally? You think you're anyone's ally? You're a coward hiding behind charity donations and pretty speeches while the world burns around you. You're everything that's wrong with celebrity culture, the illusion of substance without any actual backbone. Will shook his head slowly, almost sadly. And you're everything that's wrong with modern media, Joy. The confusion of destruction with deconstruction, the belief that tearing people down somehow builds something better. You've forgotten that there are real people behind the public figures you attack. Real people? Joy's voice cracked with emotion and rage. You want to talk about real people? What about the real people you've ignored? What about the real people you failed to stand up for? What about the real people who needed your voice and got silence instead? What about the real person sitting across from you right now? Will asked quietly, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to cut through all the noise and fury. What about treating me like a human being instead of a target? What about remembering that I have feelings? That I have a family? That your words have consequences beyond your television show? For a moment, the studio fell completely silent. Joy stared at him, her chest heaving, her face flushed with anger and something that might have been recognition. But instead of softening, she doubled down, her voice becoming even more vicious. Oh, now you want to talk about feelings? Now you want sympathy? You can't have it both ways, Will. You can't be a public figure when it benefits you, and a private person when it doesn't. You can't demand respect while showing none to the people trying to hold you accountable. That was the final straw. Will's voice, when it came, was steady but final. You're right, Joy. I can't have it both ways, and I won't. I won't sit here and be disrespected by someone who's forgotten the difference between accountability and abuse. I won't pretend that this conversation has been anything other than a performance designed to make you feel important at my expense. He began removing his microphone, his movements deliberate and calm despite the chaos around him. I came here to talk about my work, to connect with an audience that I respect. Instead, I found someone who thinks that destroying people on television passes for journalism. I'm done with this. Joy's voice rose to a screech as she realized she was losing control of the narrative. You can't just leave. You can't run away from hard questions. This is exactly what I was talking about. When things get difficult, Will Smith runs. Will paused in his departure, turning back to look at her one final time. Joy. These weren't hard questions.